Hello, everyone. Today I'm with Thom Cavalli, and Thom is the author of two books, Embodying Osiris and Alchemical Psychology. So welcome, Thom.
Thank you. Good to see you again, John.
We're going to speak about alchemy and psychology. And listening to a few of your interviews lately, I didn't realize that you did analysis with Robert Johnson. So towards the end somewhere, I'd like to ask you about Robert Johnson and India,
Sure.
your
Sure.
love affair with India. Uh,
Sure.
but I thought, I wonder whether we could maybe start with um, how alchemy found you in your travels, because I just want to say, when I woke up this morning, I was thinking, out of my Jungian friends on Facebook and on the network, and that some people seem to really gravitate towards alchemy,
Hmm.
and some don't so much. But I was thinking, it changes the way you see psychology, because I always remember Louise Von Franz. She was talking about individuation, and she said, uh, too much heat and you can spoil the work, and not enough heat and nothing happens, or whatever. And it's kind of like alchemy gives you this different view,
Yeah.
which is so true. And you start thinking about the internal heat and the
Yeah.
fire and all of that, and it kind of gives it. And the other thing that I appreciate about it so much is the experimental nature of it. That you mix the substances together and you don't quite know what you're going to get. I remember she used to do Marie Louise used to do experiments, and she was saying she mixed some things, her concoction together one day, and when she was young,
Hmm.
nothing happened. And then,
Right.
a week later or something, if I remember correctly, the whole substance had transformed. So it's kind of like, I, I appreciate that, because to me, sometimes in psychology, we're very serious. You've got to eradicate or fix something or get rid of something. Whereas in alchemy, there's that little bit of playful, hands-on experimentation or something like that.
Yeah, absolutely. There's that wonderful quote following up what you just said, the meeting of two personalities is like
Mm,
the contact of two chemical substances. If there is any reaction, both are transformed. It's one of my favorite quotes. It's
yeah.
so alchemical and it really speaks to my interest in studies and teaching. Um, yeah, alchemy found me in a not so pleasant way.
Right.
In 1977, when I was in the midst of my graduate studies, I actually had taken off a year for personal reasons. And I was not having much money and paying a lot of money towards my tuition. Had to work a full-time job. And I was working at a county-funded agency. It was called Community Resources and Self-Help. And I was a substance abuse counselor, and it also dubbed as my internship, my doctoral internship as well. And part of my duties called for me once a week to get in my car and travel. I don't remember. It was just a few miles, I think it was. This was in San Diego. And in San Diego, they have these small canyon roads that are just two-lane roads. Um, and I was driving, this will tell you something. I was driving a big Rambler, big Rambler that I think I bought it for $300 from the Hare Krishna ashram in San Diego.
Right.
And it was a real
You
blessing in
you you
disguise.
pay you paid too much, by the way.
Probably. Um, I'm kind of dating myself here because these are the days when we didn't even have seat belts.
Hmm.
So here I am driving this big old Rambler on my way to the girls' rehabilitation. It was what we call juvie today. to
mm,
counsel these girls in their cells. And I did that, for a while. But on this particular sunny afternoon, I did something I don't think I had done previously, and maybe once or twice since. I picked up a hitchhiker, and I can remember him very clearly, even though it was a long time ago, a little boy. And I think it was because he couldn't have been more than, I don't know, 12 or something like that. And so I picked him up. He got into the car, into the passenger seat, and off I went. And for as much time as it takes to reach 55 miles an hour, a car was careening around this bend, who I later found out was a sailor, because San Diego has a lot of military there.
yeah.
He must have just got off his shift, fallen asleep at the wheel, careened around this corner, swerved from side to side on the road, and hit me straight on. It was a head-on collision. Um, I obviously was unconscious. I was pulled out by firefighters, etc. Um, the
How
boy
old
was,
were you? How old were you at the time?
oh, young 30s.
Right.
I'm not sure. I'd have to do the math, but I was in my young
Yeah.
30s.
Yeah.
The boy was never to be seen again, even when media had come in, and the photographs was splashed on the front page of the newspaper the next day, and they had mentioned me, they had mentioned the other driver, and there was no mention of the boy.
Mm.
I'll kind of leave that aside because, whatever that might be, who knows. But the point in my telling you this story is that it happened in the midst of my learning how to become a psychotherapist, which was very, very Jungian oriented. I had you mentioned Robert Johnson, there was Christine Downing, there was a number of really, I fell into a wonderful Jungian community. Um, it took me years, not to recover. Physically, it was miraculous, one, that I lived, and two, the injuries were not fatal, or even disfiguring. I mean, they kind of sewed my face back up and what have you. But the memory of that trauma stayed with me for a very, very long time, and I had to kind of sort it out. I had to bring meaning to why. Why in the middle of in my, my graduate education is this happening? And I came eventually, and I've even written about this, to conclude, and this is going to sound a little highfalutin perhaps. It's not intended to be, but the best I can make of it is that this was a dismemberment experience in the tradition of, shamanic initiation. I mean, I was really busted up,
Yeah.
and reconstituted. And that's the point. And that is the connection with Osiris. I literally
Mm.
was busted up and I was reconstituted and able to finish my doctorate, etc. And there's a little bit of I don't know if I call it synchronicity, but it's like it was right in my face and I didn't understand it until I had the objectivity to realize, as I mentioned, the name of this clinic where I work, Community Resources and Self-Help, was a mouthful. People in the area, we were very successful, very well known. People didn't call it by that. It was too many words. And so it went by the acronym CRASH.
Mm.
So that was my
Quite,
first clue.
quite pertinent.
That was my first clue that this really was meant to be in some strange way. And when I say highfalutin, uh, what I mean by that is here I was learning to be a psychotherapist. That's what I do. But in this rite of passage, I became a healer. This is what I was to become. So what I do as a psychotherapist is one thing, but who I am is a healer. And I've kind of struggled with what does that really mean, and it's over the many years where I've been studying, writing, teaching about alchemy, that has become my healing profession. So now in addition to doing psychotherapy, I do something called alchemical coaching, where I sort of, take recipes, stages, colors off the alchemical shelf and work with people where I find it appropriate and helpful. So that's how alchemy called upon me. And
Would it be
I,
accurate? Would it be accurate to say that, to me, it seems like a kind of a big nigredo. Uh,
oh,
you know,
yeah, yeah.
it's kind of like just forced. What is it? Fateful nigredo
Well,
experience or something.
fate, yeah. My thinking about fate and destiny, uh, fate is what we're given. Destiny is what we do with it.
Mm.
So my fate was to, be involved in this horrific accident.
Yeah.
What I did with it was carved out a path, which led me to your door, basically.
Mm. It'd be good. We were talking just before we started, but it'd be good to get back to that because I don't know. Rick Tarnas calls this time a death rebirth mystery, which I can relate to a lot, and
Oh, I'm sorry. John, can I just interrupt you for a moment?
yeah,
Because I forgot the punchline.
yeah, sorry. Go on.
No, I'm sorry. The punchline is because you were talking about Osiris and I talked about this dismemberment experience. Um, and if you've read the book, the Osiris book, my take on that story is that it follows almost perfectly what Edinger calls the foundational alchemical recipe. In Latin, it's solve et coagula. So it is this disintegration. This is this dismemberment,
Mm.
and how we put things back together, um, not just on the same plane, but that's where transformation, transcendence brings us to a higher level. But I just needed to
Yeah,
close that gap. So it has so it was an alchemical drama, I guess you call it.
yeah, yeah, yeah. I can get that. It it's kind of like you could have had all the theory and been a great professional.
Yeah,
I mean, this might sound a bit trite, been a great professional psychologist and all that, but this uh, experience is is kind of
absolutely.
where the real substance comes from, or something like
Absolutely.
that.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you mentioned earlier, I mean, on the one hand, alchemy is a proto-science, and it has much to do with experimentation. But as you're pointing out, and I totally agree with you, alchemy is more than that. It's also about experience. So you have experiment and you have experience. And it's not one or the other. It's the combination of what you're doing with who you are, what you bring to it. And that is what differentiates it from chemistry. In chemistry, the anything to do with the empirical model, they try to shut down, shut out
Mm,
personal variables. If you
mm,
know statistics, they try to get it down to a point 0.001. If
mm.
you can really, reduce the human influence, that might be biasing the work. But as we know now from quantum physics, you can't reduce it.
Mm. And I mean, this again might be a little bit simplistic, but it seems to me that alchemy reminds us that the nigredo, the dark or the black or that
Yeah.
stage is part of it, is part of the whole process. It's kind of like, I think when I was younger anyway, you sometimes think that if you're smart enough, you can keep away from all trouble and you won't have to go through anything black kind of thing and all of that.
Yeah. Yeah.
Do the right thing. So someone can see it as wrong or not to be desired at all. Whereas alchemy kind of says, no, this is, and in the darkest of the nigredo, new seeds are somehow born. Something. So it's kind of like
Right.
it's
Right.
essential.
Yes. Um, there's a quote from some alchemical text somewhere, and I don't know it verbatim, but the gist of it is, when you have found the black, celebrate.
Yeah, right.
So in my first book, my Introduction to Alchemical Psychology, um, I talk about the three classical stages, the black, the white, the nigredo, the albedo, and the rubedo, the red. And psychologically, because I'm a psychological alchemist, I don't do physical alchemy.
Yeah,
Um, so the way I come to these three stages, the nigredo, they all correlate with a different archetype.
right.
My whole thrust in working with psychological alchemy is to make it user friendly.
Yeah.
How do we get grounded? How do we, make it a part of our lives?
Mm.
Um, and so the nigredo, the archetype that correlates to the blackening, that's what nigredo means, is the shadow. The shadow, as probably your audience knows, is that archetype that is nearest to us, and yet we repel it, we reject it in favor of the persona. We all want to put a happy face, etc. But as Maurice Stein wrote in his book, there's always a sacrifice that you make by living, in accordance with social expectation. And the sacrifice, the price that's paid is the shadow. And not only do we hide it from others, but we hide it from ourselves. So alchemy takes this, turns it around. In other words, we need to embrace the shadow, as repugnant as that might be, um, bearing in mind Jung's oftentimes quotes in Latin again, opus contra naturam, that alchemy is a work opposite to nature. In other words, rather than have a knee-jerk reaction away from shadow, we turn around and we examine it, we analyze it, we embrace it. Colloquially, we do shadow work.
Mm.
And there's a lot of, I mean, this shadow stuff, I just did a whole set of seminars on alchemical shadows. It's a vast subject, but I think it's necessary to understand that we have to meet the shadow before we can understand what's lurking in the shadow, and that is our untapped potential. This, I think, is the prima materia. This is the stuff out of which individuation is made. So when the alchemists say celebrate when you have found the darkness in yourself, uh, it then transmutes. The shadow in Jungian language then is referred to as the white shadow or the gold shadow, and so, but you have to, counter the instinct to pull away, because when we're in pain, and too much people, they talk about doing shadow work, but one
Yeah.
thing I'm always looking for, if you're not in pain by
Mm.
doing shadow work, you're not doing shadow work.
Yeah.
This is not a game. This is for real.
Yeah.
And it's hard and it's arduous. Why? Because the elements of the shadow archetype are autonomous. They don't
Mm.
want to come out into the light.
Yeah.
And so there's going to be an internal resistance.
Mm.
And so it takes a lot of, courage and
Mm.
persistence, to get
Mm.
to that point where you understand that we're not trying to reject, we're not trying to take an antidepressant pill, or, we're not trying to cut it out. This is very, very Jungian. Jung wasn't interested in resolving symptoms. He
Mm.
was more interested in enlarging the field of consciousness.
Mm.
In other words, you give something enough time, and you do the work, your conscious field is enlarged. And what seemed to be a terrible problem facing you in the nose suddenly has dissolved. And you've reconstituted into an insight. But the insight can't just be a head trip,
Yeah.
because there's an old I think it's psychoanalytic saying, the true test of insight is behavior change. Now, why is that important? Because alchemy is about manifestation. Alchemy is about a production of something. This is why when people talk about Homo sapiens, I take a kind of step back. I think long before we earned that privileged position, I think it's more accurate to call us Homo haber, man, woman, the maker. We had to make things to survive. That's where life began with tools, fire, cultivating lands, etc. That's really, I think, where life begins. So
Yeah.
I'll stop there because
That's good. That's very a lot of the passion was coming through there very strongly. But I agree with you so much, and it fits very well with James Hillman's soul making, if you ask me, that this making aspect of alchemy. But the thing is, when you first come across it, you know, you read, what do you read? Mix the warm dung of a beetle with cat urine or something like that. You see, like, you appreciate the people that worked through the old language of alchemy and bring it into kind of this form,
yeah, yeah.
that you can understand, because it is a hard thing to read the initial
Oh,
text,
it's
isn't it?
impossible. It's impossible. I mean, even Jung struggled with that. He made himself like a homemade dictionary, just to keep, he was struggling with the terms just like we are. But that's where people who are writing about have done the work, are writing and teaching about these things. So you don't have to. The real work shouldn't be studying or reading a book. It's personal.
Mm.
Now, you mentioned James Hillman, and well, I don't know if you want to hear a little of my anecdotes about James Hillman, but
Yeah.
I'm always interested in not just what a writer writes. I am, but I'm always looking. So like when people ask me where should I start reading Jung, I always say Memories, Dreams, Reflections.
Mm.
Even though he only wrote the first four chapters, I think
Mm.
Yaffe did a pretty decent job, translating or in the
Mm.
recordings. But I'm interested in the man. Did he
Yeah.
live what he's talking about?
Mm.
So with that said, I'm originally from New York City. I was born and raised in Brooklyn and hopped around the islands, but basically from there. But I've been living in Southern California now for decades.
Mm.
Um, the reason why I mention that, people in New York probably, I don't know if this has changed. I haven't been back there in quite a while, but there's sort of a smugness about New York City, especially towards people who were born and raised in New Jersey.
Right.
They're kind of like the stepchild, the wannabes, And of course, James Hillman is from or was from New Jersey. Um, in any event, I had just gotten my brand new spanking doctorate. It was like a week later, and my chair, who was Christine Downing, bless her heart, she had ridiculous confidence in this long-haired hippie who was writing about some weird subject.
Mm.
Uh, Invited me to her home in Delmar. She was living in Delmar at the time, for a party. And unbeknownst to me, and this little cocktail party, I guess you call it, who appears but James Hillman? And this was the years when he had just come out with his revisioning psychology, which it was a game changer, game changer. Even though I didn't fully grasp all because I mean I was a young 33-year-old kid, just finding my way. And uh, 3 seconds into being introduced to him, he says to me, "What does soul want?"
Yeah.
Oh my God. This is
But
James
yeah,
Hillman putting me on the spot.
but I like that about him, in the sense that it gets back to what you were saying earlier about the shadow being serious. Like, it's so easy as a Jungian person to be a bit theoretical about the
Yes,
shadow and all.
yes, yeah, yeah.
And the shadow is a serious thing. But for Hillman, the soul and living through the psyche every moment is kind of a
Right.
serious thing. You got That's the way I
Right.
take it. And
Well, the reason why, I mean, I had to think about this a lot because I was really caught flat-footed.
yeah,
I'm inflated. I mean, I just, got my doctorate, and then this giant of a man is asking me a very basic question, and
right.
I was just stumbling for words. I didn't know what the hell to say to him, but I thought about it for a long time afterwards. And what I came to realize, I had spent years studying spirit. My dissertation, which had a lot of alchemy in it, but it was also about what came to be known as the intersubjective space. Um, I was working with these drug abusers. We're both trying to manipulate each other from their at various levels. But what my dissertation is about is not about that person. It's not about my psyche. It's about this, well, what Corban would call the imaginal realm. It was this odd mixing of consciousness. That's what really hooked me. That's really what got me into alchemy. In any event, I, m- my dissertation though was particularly interested in the trickster archetype, and the trickster archetype is very much under the rubric of spirit. Not soul, spirit. So when James Hillman asked me about soul, my head was filled with all kinds of information about spirit. But there's a little bit more to the story because many years later, I had bought when I was in graduate school the hardback copy of Revisiting Psychology. And as I've gotten older, I've become more of a groupie, and I like people to sign their books. And I don't know, it must have been 30 years later or so, James Hillman is giving a talk nearby, not far from here, at Chapman University. And I come up to him after his talk, brandishing this copy, and I
Yeah.
put it in front of him, and he looks at the book, and of course he recognizes it. He looks at me, and he signs his name. And as he's signing, he says to me,
What does the
someday.
soul want? No,
I
he didn't say it this time.
I would have been better able to answer that question. No, what he said is someday this book is going to be worth some money. No, he didn't say money. He said someday this is going to be valuable. It's going to be worth something. It was something to that effect.
Wow.
And little did he know how pregnant a comment that was.
Oh, okay.
Because alchemy is not about soul, it's not about spirit, it's about the conjunctio. It's about the conjunction, the integration of the two. So prematurely, I was really, introduced again, flat-footed as I was, with, got to start thinking about soul. And over the many, many years that I've been writing and learning about this stuff, it's about both. It's about the meeting of those two personalities, those two archetypal powers.
Yeah, okay. This might be a generalization, and it's going to India. Um, so we could
Sure.
discuss that if you want, your love of India. But I noticed when I went to India, I think there was was very much an up the mountain kind of experience. I've got a feeling that many people have had that, the spirit kind of experience of India.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
So I've always been able to relate to Hillman when he talks about the soul, how it loves depth, that he had, you know, the need for both. But I didn't know that at the time. India was like, wow, like look
Yeah.
down from the mountaintop and see
Yeah.
below kind of thing.
Well, it's peaks and valleys,
Yeah.
as Hillman would write. It brings to mind on my first trip to India, which was literally very life-changing.
Mm.
This is 1978, I think it was, and I traveled. I had no money. I traveled by train. I slept in train stations or what have you. But I saw some major, major sites and had some tr profound experiences. And to your point, I don't know if you visited Khajuraho. Does
No,
that ring any bells? No.
no.
Well, Khajuraho are these incredibly tall buildings. There must be five, six of them, and they are intricately carved on the outside with absolutely every sex position imaginable. Imaginable. I mean, thousands of them. But when you go in, there's nothing. It's just darkness, with one exception. There's the yin and the yang. There is the phallic uh, penis, basically carved out of stone, and it's surrounded by the vulva. And that's sculptured alchemy. That's the conjunctio. That's the royal marriage. So yes, Jung has been near and dear to my heart. Although I have to say, and actually wrote to Robert Johnson because we kept in touch for some years later, and and a little postcard I wrote. I have to admit, because Robert loved India. We had just started analytic therapy, I think after his first trip or something like that, and I had just come back. So we had a love affair talking about India. But years later, I visited on my first trip to Egypt, and which is the homeland of alchemy, of course. And I said to Robert, I wrote to Robert, I said, I've taken a second wife, Egypt.
Yeah.
And so India is very special to me, but so is Egypt. And of course, the word alchemy comes from the black, the chem, not
Mm.
having to do with black magic or anything. It has to do, again, with Osiris. It has to do with the inundation left by the annual inundation of the Nile, which fertilized the land and enabled, if you look at a aerial photograph, even today, of Egypt, what you see is the tree of life. Everything is, because the water can only, extend so much. That's where the farms, that's where what they used to call nomes and settlements and cities are all cuddled, huddled up to the Nile, except when you get into the delta, and then the delta, it spreads out like the branches on a tree. It's incredible, incredible.
Just tell us a little bit about, the difference in. I've never been to Egypt, right? And
Oh, you
you
must
know,
go. You must go. You tell
so
me, and I'll tell you what to see.
okay, sounds good. But I mean, tell us a little bit about the difference for you between India and Egypt. What the
Oh,
difference
oh,
in feeling or style or something? Tell
oh,
us about
yeah.
it.
Um, India was hallucinogenic.
Well, you were
Uh,
a hippie, right? And so it was a
I
natural
was
progression.
I was smoking weed every day. But even if I weren't, I mean, the if you've been to India as you have, it is the antithesis of the linearity and the centrality of the way cities in the Western world are constructed. It
Yeah,
is organic, everything kind of flows, which
yeah.
I think is an outer reflection of the kind of consciousness these folks have.
Hmm.
Um, uh, Egypt is very different. Egypt has been modernized, of course, it's been vanquished many times, but there stand these magnificent temples and pyramids and what have you, that are timeless. I recall a story that Jung, when he was in Cairo, he was in a taxi and they're driving through the city, and he says to the cabbie, he said, this civilization is 5,000 years old. Can't you do better than have all of these ghettos and poor people and what have you? And the cab driver turned to or said to Jung, he said, well, this is all transitory. Egypt was created and is dedicated to what comes in eternity after this life. And that's exactly what I feel when I've been to Egypt a couple times. There's a kind of eternity carved into the stone. Is the best I could put to it. It's And then I dived into Egyptian cosmology and mythology and religion, and these were brilliant people. I mean, they still don't know how they build the pyramids. I mean, it's amazing. it's a timeless place. But so is India, but
Yeah.
it's
But
organized differently. I mean, they have got, streets and, they're much more westernized in India.
yeah, that's great.
On my last trip to Egypt, I think it was
Mm.
2 years ago. We were sailing up the Nile, and this was a kind of a real special group that I was in. And much to my surprise, they like surprising us, and so they pulled the boat over to a beach, or I guess we call it a beach, and we swam in the Nile. I mean, talk about an immersive experience.
Mm.
And I was with my buddy who is also very much into alchemy, and together we we're involved in this incredible group called Domus Hermetica, which I advise everybody to check out. It's really spectacular. And I was there on the beach, and I said, "John, we're on the Nile, we're in the water," and he stooped down and he grabbed some mud and he held it to
Wow.
my face and said, "There it is, alchemy." And so
Did you?
I brought some back. Let's see here. I
That
think
was
it's
my
in.
next. That was my next question. Did you get it through custom?
Absolutely. Well, I didn't at that moment because it didn't occur to me. So we got back on the boat and we're sailing up the Nile, and the staff on this boat, it was maybe 100 feet long, didn't speak English, and so I somehow or other had to convince them to pull the boat over and have they wouldn't let me off. And so one of them got off the boat and I gave him a plastic bag and I came back with a whole bag of mud, which is to me sacred.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I mean, I want to go further with this story of Osiris, though, in the sense that, again, we were talking just very briefly before we started, but
Yeah.
it seems to me in this time, which is a bit like a death, rebirth kind of time, there's something so. I mean, if someone said to you, how is that story of Osiris relevant to this time on a psychological level, what would you say?
It's how we live life. I mean, who has not experienced a breakdown to whatever degree
Yeah.
and live to tell about it and come out, having learned something? So
Mm.
solve et coagula, the separation and reintegration is the process of life.
Mm.
Now, many people might not look at it that way, but that's where an analytic standpoint really helps. We're able to kind of take a step back, however long it might take, and say, okay, this happened for a reason.
Mm.
And even though it was a terrible trauma or abuse or whatever it might be, it happened for a reason. And
Mm.
I believe that we're meaning makers, that we
Mm.
take the prima materia, however shitty, black, and dark it is, and try
Mm.
to make something of it.
Mm.
But we have to leave the ordinary, rational, dualistic model
Yeah.
where everything, I mean, Jung is founded on a theory of opposites. But
Mm.
if you look at ancient Egyptian mythology and cosmology, they talk about something called the perfect black. And it's my understanding, having studied this, is that they're looking at black not relationally. They're not looking at it to be defined by white. It's
Mm.
opposite. They're
Mm.
just looking at the black. And when
Mm.
you just, you just study the black, you
Mm.
start to discover the beauty of blackness and
Mm.
you start to discover the regenerative properties. So
Mm.
while everybody's fleeing from a nose sniffle, you know,
Yeah. Yeah.
this again, you have to kind of adopt a very, very non-dualistic perspective when you're doing alchemy, because alchemy basically is I believe it's a psychoidal science because
I,
these guys,
can you
if
repeat?
you're, the psychoid is an archetype that kind of
Mm.
came kind of late in Jung's career when he coined that term. And it's the
Mm.
idea that, there are different strata of
Mm.
consciousness. You've got personal unconscious, you've got the collective unconscious, but beneath it all is another deep strata that he calls the psychoid. And that is the meeting. That's the meeting place of psyche and soma, mind and
mm,
body. In some mysterious, interactive ways, produces everything in this world. And I
yeah.
think that the alchemists, however naive, because you can't just, you know, group
Take it
out
literal.
alchemists into one category. There are many different, it's Chinese alchemists, Indian alchemists, and they all
Yeah.
had different, perspectives. But I think that they were all dealing with these variables, psyche and soma.
So did they, that was going to be a question of mine with Indian alchemy. Um, can you connect it back to a source? Or like, for example, in the Renaissance, they went back to Egypt and the Hermeticum or whatever it was, and they drew from that, didn't they? But did India draw from Egypt, or did
Did it
Egypt
draw
draw
from
from India?
Egypt?
Hmm.
Oh gosh. It's funny you should ask that. I'm trying to think who I was thinking I was being interviewed by somebody recently. Oh no, I was attending a podcast in any event.
Hmm.
Um, um, if you're familiar with the picture, it's a very, very ubiquitous picture from ancient Egypt, and it has Nut, which is the celestial goddess, who forms the firmament. And in the separatio, the separation that took place, producing different generations. She, Newt, was separated from Geb. Geb is the male counterpart to Newt. So you have this space, formed by Newt above and Geb below. What's fascinating though is a couple things. One, that forms a space. And you know who lives in that space? John, you and me, and the rest of us. So we are hybrid creatures
Hmm.
of the above and the below. Now,
Hmm.
what's curious, if you look at the picture, Gab, whereas Newt is arched over, kind of makes she forms the heavens, but he is in this really strange posture. Now, I don't know if you do yoga. I do a little bit of yoga, each day, blah blah blah. And the he it's a yogic pose. So if there and this is what I asked this
Yeah.
Egyptian expert, and she was marvelous. Colleen Dorman, I think it was, and she
Hmm.
really knows her stuff about
Hmm.
Egypt. She's an Egyptologist, and I
Hmm.
asked her about that, following
Yeah.
up on what you were asking me. I said, that really looks like a yogic pose. Is there a
Hmm.
connection? She had to feign ignorance. She said, I don't know. But I know of it. She couldn't recall, but there's some woman author who has done a lot of research. So I don't have a good answer for you, but it's in the books. I mean,
Yeah.
it's been studied, the
Hmm.
relationship between these two ancient cultures.
Yeah. Okay. That's interesting. And another thing I'd like to ask you is, okay, we talked about the nigredo, right? And
Yeah.
the necessity of
Yes.
black, I would almost say.
Yeah.
But the albedo, if we're thinking about the stages, the albedo and then the rubedo, so how would you describe what would we call it? The movement through maybe those stages, or
Yeah.
what's the difference between the albedo and the rubedo?
Let's back up for a moment here. Every morning I get up fairly early
Yep.
when before the sun has risen, and I sit in my living room. And
Yep.
about a year ago, in my mind, I had a breakthrough
Right.
because I was observing, sitting on my couch, sitting, drinking my coffee, watching the light come. And if you watch the progression of light going out of darkness and into white, it's not dichotomous. There are different gradations. So for example, I think when so I don't think that it's any this is very naturalistic, maybe even Gnostic understanding of how those colors came to be.
mm,
You have to kind of go back and think that these people are not of the Western mind. They're
mm,
living in nature. So
mm,
this was very natural to them, you know? And
mm,
so they were observing the changing of the colors that,
mm,
you know, I mean, Hillman talks about blue,
mm.
you know, and silver. So
He's
if you
big on
watch
the
the
blue.
sun rising, you watch the sun rising, these are the gradations that you see. Now, when you get to the albedo, first of all, you know, it's a much more feminine stage. So it has two basic meanings before we get to the rubedo.
Mm,
One is that it has much to do, again, with archetypes, in this case, particularly with the anima, the feminine principle of relatedness. So now that we've kind of dealt with ourselves in the nigredo, you got to take it into the daylight, which means you have to then interact, you have to bring it into the world. And anima uh, has to do with relatedness, but it also has to do with sulfur. Sulfur, you know, it's combustible. It brings things to life. So when we use the word animate, it comes from the word anima,
mm,
and it's bringing to life into the light of day the unconscious.
mm,
So that's one interpretation. The other is illumination for
mm.
obvious reasons, which could be good or bad because an illumination could just as well be an inflation
Yeah.
as some profound insight. So there's work to be done there as well. So in the first stage, we're dealing with the relationship with ourselves, and albedo is the relationship with others, and in the rubedo, you're dealing with the relationship with God, however you define God. So I call that the divine self. We have the real self, we have the individuated self, and then we have the divine self. Now, bear in mind, you know, this is a model. It's a model
Yeah,
like
yeah,
anything
yeah, yeah.
else. We don't just simply go for
It's a helpful model though.
it
I
is
mean,
helpful.
the colors black, white, red, and to add in the others that other people do, but it's helpful to think about things, to think about many
I
things.
just got a new client, a young woman
Mm,
in her mid-30s.
mm,
She was really interested in learning about alchemy. This is coaching, not therapy. And my God,
yeah.
she had just gotten a bad cold that her mother or grandmother is in a hospital and blah. She was in the midst of emergency and she was really scattered. She's here,
Mm,
there, everywhere.
mm,
My God. And she even apologized. She said, you know, this is not my normal self, but here I am. And I said, you know,
mm,
it's almost like a crisis. And I'm going to see her again next week. And I thought, you know, what alchemically, she needs salt.
mm,
Salt is earth. It was Paracelsus who then brought the concept of salt to what had been in place in medicine for hundreds of years from Galen and Hippocrates, and that was the sulfur mercury. Everything in some combination came out of that, and then to this Paracelsus comes along and says, no,
mm,
we have to add salt. That's the tria prima is what it's called. And so why this woman needs salt is it's grounding.
mm,
She needs to be grounded because
mm,
she's being pulled in 10 different directions. And,
mm,
you know, I'm being pulled, I'm trying to be helpful. I'm being pulled in 10 different directions with her. But then I step back and I go, okay, wait a minute. I
mm,
need some objectivity. She needs some objectivity. She needs, you know, a dash of salt. She needs to be grounded. Otherwise, she will be swept up by all
mm,
of these what appear to be emergencies when they're really
mm,
not.
mm.
What makes them an emergency is that there's too many problems happening simultaneously,
Yeah.
any one of which she can probably deal with just fine if they were sequential.
Mm, yeah. So there's not
So
only
it
the
is helpful. It
colors,
is helpful. It is
but
helpful.
there's the sulfur and the salt and all these things that can help you think about where you are at any given point in time.
It's what
And
you need. It's what you need. It's
mm,
just like with typology. You've got four functions. You know, you particularly have you land in your most natural place at the superior function. But that's just the beginning because then you
mm,
then locate what the inferior function is,
mm,
and do the work on that. But
mm,
ultimately, what you really want is to transcend them all. And that's why Jung, I believe, introduced the transcendental function. So what does that mean operationally? Well, every situation needs a little bit of an extrovert, or it needs a sensate, or it needs a feeling type. And it's the alchemy when you're living in that zone, because this is what von Franz talks about, the active imagination that brings us to the transcendental function. Then we pick and choose, within ourselves what is necessary. This woman needs salt. She
yeah.
needs salt would be the sensate. It's very earthy. It's very palpable. And that's what
Mm,
she needs. Otherwise, she's going to be, God knows where she'll be.
mm,
She'll be torn apart, and maybe she needs to be torn apart. I don't believe that with this woman, but
mm,
sometimes problems happen for a reason. We have crises for a reason. And as the
mm,
Chinese say, within the hexagram for crisis, there's opportunity.
mm, mm. That's good. I do want to add in a little something though, is that I remember in Jung's Mysterium Conjunctus, he talks about who does he talk about? Gerald Dorn, who said that there were two stages to the opus, and there was the unio mentalis and then the unus
There's three.
mundus.
There's three.
Oh, okay, three.
Yeah, three.
I mean, I must have missed. Maybe I've got a book with a couple of pages missing in that. And but let me say, I kind of noticed those two stages anyway. And what it meant to me is I've always seen the unio mentalis reminds me of going to India and kind of lifting into the spirit a little, the albedo, the whiteness, the detachment from Maya and the senses or whatever. It's where a lot of ex-hippies went to India and they did that kind of thing. And then I've seen the rubedo. It's more like the unus mundus of
Yes, yes,
coming
yes,
back into the world with soul, or the
yes.
spirit soul that you were talking about
Yeah,
earlier, maybe.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, you're right. So the three stages are, if I remember the terms right, I think he uses the unio naturalis. And in
Right.
that stage, you're taking out spirit and soul from the body. Why do you want to do that? Because otherwise, we're just a slave to the instincts, habit, and routine. In the second stage, the unio mentalis, you're dealing with the union of soul and spirit. That's a conjunctio, but it can't just be separate from the body. So the unus mundus is putting that union back in to the body. But in the process of doing that, you're discovering what the words mean, and that is the one world. So
Yeah.
the concept of the one world in psychological terms means that we're moving at an initial stage of undifferentiated consciousness into something that is more conscious. So
Mm,
that we begin to realize, we're not, well, this is the paradox of alchemy. They call it the one and the many.
mm,
We don't sacrifice who we are when we realize that we're interdependent. We really are a paradox. We're hybrids. We're in two places at the same time.
mm. And Tom, out of all of those images of the culmination of the work,
Yeah.
culmination of the opus, what's your favorite one? Which one do you love? There's the Philosopher's Stone. I mean, there seems to be a million names
For the
for,
stone?
yeah, the stone. What do you like?
Well, first of all, what are we talking about? Dorn himself, there's a great quote. I think it goes like, transform yourself from a dead stone into a living philosophical stone. So what does that mean?
Mm,
And the way that when I'm teaching this stuff, I say, well, what's the difference between a rock and a stone?
mm,
Now, I'm not a geologist, but in
mm,
my imagination,
mm,
that rock is the dead stone that Dorn is talking about. It's not a living entity. It's complacency. It's just following the herd. But when we have the passion and the interest and the excitement and we do the work, we are investing tremendous libidinal energy into that. and then we become not a rock. Now we are a living stone. Now, these are all symbolic words, but what the hell does that really mean functionally? It means a lot of things, but essentially, I think the lapis philosophorum in Latin, philosopher's stone, basically means it's a higher level of consciousness, and it's one in which we have done the work, like going back to nigredo, of withdrawing those shadows, projections, and finding it within ourselves. It's a discovery of the anima. It's a discovery of all of these things that create an integral consciousness.
Mm.
Now, do we ever get there? Probably not.
No.
I mean, maybe some sages do, but I was during those years when I was in the accident, I was a sannyasin. I was in love with Rajneesh and wore the mala and the rest of it, and it was lovely for the time being. But years later, he travels to Oregon and his lieutenants are poisoning the townspeople. And
It
he's
took.
sitting there, meditating and screwing the girls. So every guru, every saint has his or her shadow.
Mm.
And so, that's so the stone is an idealized version of integrating the good and the bad, the dark with the white, and but preserving equanimity that we are not pulled in
Mm.
either direction.
Mm.
This was Jung's great essay, Answer to Job, when he said,
Mm.
basically, even God has a shadow, you
Mm.
know. So, I mean, there's a lot more descriptors that, it would take another hour to go into describing what actually is the stone. What are they really talking about?
Mm.
Equanimity is one, withdrawing projections, basically being really who you are and not a carbon copy of what's been handed to you.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I always get the feeling of the substance of the stone that it's been taken out of the what is it, the theoretical or just the strictly imaginal and brought into something substantial and living within the
Yeah, yeah,
self or whatever.
yeah.
And just to go back to Robert Johnson for a second, I think forgetting so many other things that he said and did and contributed, just this idea that there's gold in the shadow, just those few words, that there's gold in the shadow has left a lasting, um, I don't know, it seems like in a way that somehow that's some kind of culmination of the process as well, that there's some
Well,
gold in the shadow.
that process, Robert used to call me his dark brother.
Yeah,
I mean, I literally was the opposite temperament than Robert. Robert, if you know him or even listen to him on tapes and what have, he is the most profound, introverted man I have ever
yeah,
encountered. You can literally be sucked up into this void with him.
yeah.
But I think he was amused by me because here's this 33-year-old wild guy, extroverted and what have you, and we were a pair of opposites. I
Mm.
think for the couple of years that I saw him, I think 90% of the time I would tell him a dream or what's going on in my life. And he would always have the same words. He would always say, he'd shake his head and go, too much, too much. Until, unfortunately, the fateful day came when it was too much. I walked in with a shirt that I had found on the beach. It was like brand new, but it had a picture of
It
Jaws.
wasn't that shirt you've got on now, is it?
No, no,
Because
no.
that would have spun him out. It spins me out.
Well, no, this was worse, a lot worse. It had a picture. Do you know the picture of Jaws where the shark is coming up, gnashing its teeth out of the water? You're too young. In any case, he saw that and he had it with me. I mean, he wasn't mean or anything, but he ended the therapy just like that. It was too much. I
You know,
hadn't kept. That was too much for him.
I saw him on a video, and I thought I have never seen anyone that introvert in my whole life.
Yeah,
And
yeah, he
to the
was. Yeah,
extent that it almost seemed painful, his sensitivity.
yeah,
But I find his work beautiful. I'm not saying
Oh
that in
yeah.
any negative way. Like his gift to the world has been very
Oh
beautiful.
yeah. Oh yeah. Oh, Robert is the most. He used to write to me every once in a while, and he would always address me as gentleman. He would put a little hyphen between gentleman, gentleman. And Robert was the epitome of a gentleman. I mean, he was the most gentle soul. He, if there was any living saint that I've ever been in proximity to, and a lot of it has to do with projection because I had a really terrible upbringing with my narcissistic father. I needed a daddy, a father who could explain life to me, and Robert was that man. He was my rock.
Mm.
I would come in asking, you know, these kind of crazy questions, and he always had a good answer. I mean, I remember once saying, Robert, I got this sound in my head. It's always there. Sometimes I pay attention to it, and sometimes I don't. And he just looked at me and he says, Oh, that's the universal sound. That's Om. And I went, Oh,
I think, getting back to something you said earlier about the persona, because why is this stuff a little hard to understand sometimes or to be introduced to, And it's kind of like, okay, there was the rational enlightenment, but then there was this straight upward path towards material success or whatever as well. And so the persona, it seems to me, has become such a big thing in all of that. And then you get the people like Robert Johnson who are, uh, their lack of adaptation is beautiful in the sense of to just say something
yes,
like that.
yes, right,
That's the sound
right.
of on because 97% of the population might find that a bit of an out there kind of thing to say.
Well, we are in trouble. I mean, we really are. I mean, this is a nigredo, cultural, global nigredo, I think, because of what you're saying. I mean, at least what you're pointing to. With the advent of computers and, now we have AI. I'm writing a book right now on alchemical work, and I start the book by saying, if we lost our eyesight, it would be traumatic. If we lost our hearing, it would be terrible. In some ways, we've lost the imagination and we don't even know it. What's critical to doing alchemical work is what the alchemists call imaginatio, imagination, but they didn't mean what we mean by it. We
They
use
didn't
that
mean
word to mean
fantasy.
fantasy, right? No,
Yeah.
no. This was a faculty,
Mm,
that they use.
mm,
And that now we live on borrowed images. We don't
mm,
have to think for ourselves. We just call out or write into AI or chat GPT or whatever, and we've lost critical thinking. And the more we've done that, we have lost touch ultimately with nature. So much so that we've forgotten that we are nature. Nature isn't an object, it isn't something out there. See, that
mm,
goes back to the dualistic split. And
mm,
we have people like Francis Bacon to thank for that, by the way.
mm,
Although I think he had good intention, but it opened the doorway to this drifting further and further and further away. And with it, now we pop pills instead of, say, this is part of life also.
mm,
This problem gives texture to life. What I do
mm,
with it can give meaning to life.
mm.
We've lost
Like like
the
even
natural
some of the
instinct.
salt. The salt adds that kind of. I think Hillman said this in his book on alchemy. The well, they say about people salt of the earth, but the substance of the salt. So these
Yeah,
things are kind of that's the real stuff.
yeah,
You know.
yeah, absolutely. You see, what happens is when we're in pain, whether it's physical or psychological pain,
Mm,
our natural reaction is constriction.
right.
The problem is when we constrict, we're not just constricting physically, we're constricting our imagination. So we lose sight of creative, think out of the box solutions.
Mm,
That's why the word solution it has to do with solve, it has to do with separate, it has to do with solutions, not fixes. We are
mm,
in a very utilitarian culture where all we want to do is fix things.
mm.
Most of psychology, psychotherapy is cognitive behavioral therapy. And I'm not slamming it. I mean, I use it
Yeah,
occasionally, but I mean, Jungian analytic psychology is the grand theory.
yeah. And so just, maybe finally, Tom, what do you say to people when they first come along to be introduced to alchemy and to introduce to all of this? What's some of the first things you say when people come along, considering that we've come from this environment, being bombarded by images and fast change and all of that?
Well, I don't have a single answer for that. But you always start where people are at. And most people, if they hear the word alchemy, if they know anything about alchemy, they know one thing, changing lead into gold. Now, if the alchemist had a collider, one of these atom smashers, they could have transmuted literally lead into gold. They could have done that. But alchemy is so much more than that, because that was done. And by the way, it was done in 1919 by Rutherford, the father of atomic physics, where he actually demonstrated the artificial transmutation. And then the doors open up, and now we know everything is in transformation. That's the physical side of it. But when some people comes to me, I say, well, yeah, I mean, yeah, that's a half truth because there's so much more to alchemy. And if we look at it metaphorically, what the hell does lead mean? What's so great about lead? I mean, what's so great about gold? Well, think about it. What does gold do? Why is it so precious? I mean, it's shiny, it's beautiful, it doesn't rust. So that is a perfect metaphor for immortality. As we get older, we rust, we rot. So most people can get that. It's a nice little segue. It's a nice little transition to have them thinking more of psychological, and sometimes I do spiritual alchemy as well. I mean, historically, alchemy went from ancient Egypt, which to my mind was pre-alchemy. It was more of a magical craft. Then we have Zosimos in about 300 AD. He introduces spiritual alchemy. And then along the way, ultimately, after the Middle Ages and all of the experiments that were going on there, in comes Jung. And now we have a psychological alchemy. So alchemy itself has been changing over the years, and we need to keep a pace. That's why I do podcasts like this, because I believe that this is essential. This is
Mm,
salvational. We
mm,
can't keep living somebody else's life, borrowed images, because who said it? War is a lack of imagination.
mm.
Because we're dealing, in Jung's spectrum is the instincts below, but at the top are the archetypes. And we're living too much at the base chakra. We need to move up to a more enlightened place.
And in my experience, with my limited experience of alchemy, admittedly, it brings such a range of imagination if you're patient with it.
Oh,
It
it's wild. It's wild.
it's got a wild range,
Wild. It's
and
wild.
but rich is also the other word, and it's almost like we need so many ways of looking at things to be able to kind of do that work. We need so much of an imagination.
Oh, absolutely. Um it's a bit of an advertisement, I suppose, but I'm working now putting together another. Every year I do a set of seminars, and the one
Yeah,
that I'm putting on in the fall is called Alchemy on Mars. But Mars is an acronym.
right.
M for medicine, A for art, R for religion, and S for science.
Yeah. Cool.
So alchemy begins as an applied philosophy, but now we can apply it to all those various areas.
Okay.
So
Okay.
when you say it's a broad range, you're absolutely right, because it is a philosophy. It understands the essence of life.
I'm going to put this link up when this podcast goes out. I'll put the link up for
Oh,
your
great. Thank you.
page there, Tom. I just want to ask you one final small question. What was your thesis on again for your PhD? Was it on the trickster?
It was how the archetype of the trickster enters into the treatment of substance abusers.
Have you got a bit of the trickster in you? How would you describe it? Just to
If
finish.
you, everybody in my family knows. Every year I used to trick my daughter on trick or treat day until she got old enough, and she said, "You know, Dad, you tell me these long stories, and I believe you because you're my father, but then you get April Fools." And she says, "You're being mean and that hurts." And I go, "Okay, I won't do that anymore." So I stopped.
I think sometimes people forget about the joy of the trickster, like in the sense of,
Oh, he's fun. Yeah. Yeah. He
they
turns the
kind of
world
like, I
upside.
think, oh, he's going to trick me, you know.
Well, he turns the world upside down.
Mm.
He's mercurius. He's the
Mm.
ability to go into places but come out of them unscathed. So we can,
Apart from when he shoots himself in the foot by his own devices, because the trickster does do that.
oh, absolutely.
But
He can
that
fool
kind of,
himself. He tricks himself, right?
but that mercurial thing is, I don't know. If you ask me, it's sometimes missing a bit in psychology too. It's like, even though we
Oh,
talk about trickster and all that, but it can get a bit earnest, and you need a bit of that
a
mercurial.
trickster could be your best friend, your best ally, or your worst enemy. And what it has to do with is how conscious a relationship you have with him. In fact, that
When
was the
they
first
talk
thing,
about
this woman that
wise
I
boys,
mentioned earlier, the first thing when she poured out and said this, that, and I said, I don't know if you're into mythology, I said to her, and I'm just going to mention this in passing. You need to befriend Hermes.
mm,
He's the trickster, the ancient Greek trickster, and he's the Lord of the crossroads. And right now, I said to her, you're at a crossroads.
mm,
So you want to erect a hermstone or in some way,
yeah,
adore, archetypes are gods and they want your attention. And if they don't get it, they'll poke you in the ass.
mm. Hermes, Mercurius in Italy, I think.
Because
But and Mercurius essential to the alchemical process as well, I think, isn't
he's the patron saint of alchemy.
it? Mm,
When the experiment, everything has gone into the vessel,
mm,
and it could take months, years, and with stages and prayers and God knows what. It's not sealed until there's a spiritual infusion. And only when and if Mercurius enters into the vessel is it hermetically sealed.
that's cool. Because we sometimes think we're doing this stuff, but it's like it's Mercurius that kind of does it half the time.
Well, that's because we're living in a pre-Copernican world where everything revolves around us.
Mm,
That's why, going back to where this started, when people ask me, how did I get into alchemy? No, that's the wrong question. How did
mm,
alchemy find me?
yeah,
Because that's where Jung talks about the object psyche, the objective psyche, that there
yeah,
is a wisdom out there. We have a lot of information and toss around data,
mm,
but we don't have wisdom. Wisdom comes
mm,
from the archetype of the self. And so, you don't have to come up with answers. You have to surrender yourself to a higher power.
yeah. That's a very good place to finish. And I want to thank you very much. There's so much good and rich stuff
Oh,
in
yeah.
there, and so much imagination in there.
Thank you. It's always a pleasure, John.